President Donald Trump appears to be on a war footing with Iran, while at the same time considering Tehran's proposal for indirect nuclear talks. Now, as many as 6 B-2 stealth bombers were deployed by the U.S. last week to a military base in the Indian Ocean. And this week, the Pentagon confirmed the deployment of additional troops and air assets to the Middle East, with 2 aircraft carriers stationed around Asia. Russia, meanwhile, is trying to dissuade President Trump from striking Iran's nuclear facilities. The Kremlin warns of, quote, catastrophic consequences if those sites are hit. Tehran, in turn, says it's armed and ready with missiles capable, allegedly, of reaching American strategic assets. An Iranian lawmaker has even advocated for Tehran to copy the North Korean model and develop and test an atomic bomb. There's a lot at play, and a lot of movements, and the stakes are high. Joining us to help break down these developments is Dr. Eric Mandel, the founder and director of MEPIN, the Middle East Political and Information Network.
And the Russians owe the Iranians because they've been very helpful to them during their Ukraine war. So Iran is not giving up. Iran's proxies, they may be down, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, but they're not stopping. If you want to stop the proxies, you stop Tehran. You want to have a more stable Middle East, the address is the nuclear facilities, and most importantly, don't forget the Iranian people.
I'm Negar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Dr. Eric Mandel, thank you so much for joining us from New York.
It's a pleasure being with you.
So, Dr. Mandel, I think people really want to know, is the U.S. going to war with Iran, or is this part of a broader strategy of negotiations? I mean, you've got the B-2S in the Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. So obviously, that is a clear signal that the U.S. is prepared to use force. But at the same time, we hear mixed messaging. We hear about, indirect talks with Iran. So give us a clue. What is really going on here? And I think the thing with President Donald Trump is you never really know. Oftentimes he does make threats and doesn't necessarily follow through with it. We've heard him say that he's going to hold Iran responsible for the Houthi attacks if they don't cease, yet the Houthis keep attacking. A few weeks ago, you heard if the hostages are not released in a certain matter of time by this certain date, all hell will break loose, but then yet nothing happened. So what's the deal here? What's really going on in your view?
I don't think anybody but the president himself knows what he's going to do. And he does seem to change his mind frequently. He seems to have a strategy, a transactional approach, where he comes out with the most maximum type of threat and then backs off. I think he thinks it gives him some leverage. The question, I actually wrote a piece, I believe it was for The Hill, do these very sophisticated New York real estate people realize they are dealing in, whether with Hamas or whether with the Iranian regime, that they're dealing with ideological jihadists, of whether of the Sunni Shiite types, that you can do the same type of negotiating strategy? And I question that. I would say the two people I think who really get it in the administration, but I'm not sure how much influence they have, is the National Security Advisor Waltz and Secretary of State Rubio. I worked for many permutations with Rubio's office in the Senate, and that people really know and get the region. So what does Donald Trump want? So let's look on the threat side. So half of the American B-2 fleet, I think they left from Missouri, which has the ability to deliver massive ordnance penetrators that can get deep within whether Natanz and Fordo, are there. And that certainly was within striking distance. They could also be used against the Houthis. There's possibly not deeply embedded, but maybe those massive 30,000-pound ordnances could be used. Why 30,000 pounds? Of that 30,000 pounds, and I'll get in the weeds a little bit, of these massive ordinances, 24,000 of the 30,000 is actually metal to get through the concrete, the buried nature to get deep. There's only 6,000 pounds of explosives in the ones that want to penetrate deeply. So that's why they're. Also been reported by open source intelligence, so I believe it's true, that there's been 140 American support aircraft that have gone to American bases throughout the Middle East. Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. Although every one of those countries has said we will not let any type of direct or indirect strikes go against Iran. And I can't blame them because America, they don't know how reliable ally they are if America with Israel attacks Iran, and they will suffer the repercussions. The Saudis and the allies realized that after 2019, during the first Trump administration, when Iran attacked and knocked down at least 50% of oil production in Saudi Arabia, America had no response.
That's interesting because, Saudi Arabia and Iran are obviously not friends. So I was wondering and why the response, especially given how close MBS is, the leader of Saudi Arabia, with Jared Kushner.
Well, I think that's an economic relationship, and I don't think Jared Kushner is directly working with his father-in-law at this point of time. But the Saudis are fearful. I think one of the things that happened as a consequence of no American action in 2019 is the Saudis actually had rapprochement with the Iranians. I've been in Riyadh, and I met with, at that time, two of the three last Saudi ambassadors to Iran, and they have a whole think tank in Saudi Arabia about Iran because it is their number one fear. They fear that Iran is going to want Mecca and Medina. They look at them, the Sunnis has been putting down the Shiites. I mean, there's a lot of history, sectarianism that's there, but the Saudis are worried that America won't be there with them for the long term. And I think the other nations are like that, that are there. I think we need to be unambiguous about how we deal with Iran. So getting back to your original question about, is this a threat for negotiations with the Iranians? And will, if the Iranians, who are masters of negotiating and really playing previous American administrations, is the Trump administration going to fall for what's going on? A sign that was not positive is when you saw Witkoff, he's the special negotiator, kind of talking about Hamas being kind of good guys and they're not ideological. That kind of scared me, that they don't really understand, radicalism, radical Islam, again, of the Shia to Sunni variety that's there. I think the key, if I was advising the president, and what I would tell Congress, and I actually met with State Department people, is there needs to be an expiration date here on negotiations. You want to do indirect negotiations, which supposedly the President Trump is now or is agreeing to, fine, that's just going to slow things down. But if we have a date of, say, July 1st that you haven't acted upon, then we are, all bets are off. By the way, that has to have a caveat with it, that if we see you racing to a nuclear bomb, we will not wait till July 1st. Now, there really is an expiration date that's sitting out there, and that is in October 2025, when UN Security Council Resolution 2231, the snapback sanctions, which you don't need all 5 members of the Security Council to initiate, ends. You don't have that ability. And I think, again, if I was advising them, I would do snapback now as part of the maximum sanctions. And one of the reasons maximum sanctions, people will listen who aren't in the weeds, and they'll say, but the sanctions have been there. There's been plenty of sanctions against Iran. Unfortunately, the last administration did not enforce sanctions to the point that Iran was selling cheap oil to America's number one adversary, China, at a discounted rate, and the amount had broken all records. So now the new president, Trump, wants to go back to maximum sanctions, and he needs to ramp them up as soon as possible. The key on sanctions, though, is, I would say, would be secondary sanctions. What are secondary sanctions? That means that countries that buy Iranian goods or oil are then sanctioned when they want to export to the United States. A tariff, if you will, would be put on them. So, for example, China exports to the United States 10 times as much as it imports from Iran. So if we had an additional tariff, and we know the president loves tariffs, then that would be something else to make them pay a price. Now, there are some American allies that can get caught up in this, the Iranians, but I think mainly China, but I think secondary tariffs would really make a huge difference here, because you need to put economic pressure, because one of the things the regime wants to do is to survive. And if they're economically imperiled, that is the only thing. I hope President Trump doesn't fall into the trap, and his negotiators, that they can appease the Iranians somehow. In the Middle East, and again, it's whether Sunnis or Shiites, in the Middle East, power is what's respected. And all that niceties of appeasement is basically considered weakness to be taken advantage of.
And that seemed to be Biden's approach with Iran as well.
Unfortunately, it was. And, after 4 years, nothing was changing once they realized that. They said they wanted to get back into the JCPOA. The Iranians didn't see any reason for them to do that. They weren't paying a price. And the Biden administration, I think, made a profound mistake that after 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, never just would maybe even would basically say we'll have some new sanctions, but actually never enforce them. And the American people didn't know this. And I think the American people don't realize that these type of things of increasing sanctions, military threats, credible military threats, and maybe even military action actually will stabilize the region. Because the question that should be told to the American people is, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, which kind of we can talk all about how dangerous that would be. That would mean a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East. And who knows, in any of these unstable countries, when they get a nuclear weapon, what jihadist group could take over those nuclear weapons. And so imagine, for example, Israel had not knocked out the Syrian nuclear program way back, it was 2008, I guess it was. And ISIS eventually could have had nuclear weapons.
Wow.
10 years, less than 10 years later. I mean, we, unfortunately, Americans think of the month, of the year, and that's long term. My friends, my Persian friends, my Arab friends, they have strategic patience. And people would say the JCPOA is before snapbacks, before sunset provisions occur in that JCPOA. Oh, it's a long time away, 10, 15 years. And to the Middle East, that's a snap of a finger. To America, that's a lifetime.
That's a very good point. I think it was the Taliban that said, to the Americans, you may have the watch, but we have the time.
Exactly.
Now, we talked about Trump's threats and if we should take it seriously. What about Iran? How serious should we take Iran's threats? They say that they have the capability to strike U.S. strategic targets in the Middle East. Do you buy it?
Well, if we're talking about Diego Garcia, I do not believe they have the ballistic missiles to have that range of what's going on. And we've already seen, not once, but twice, last year in April and in October, the two largest ballistic and cruise missile attacks in history against Israel, that the United States, Israel, and allies basically stopped 95+%. Do they have more ballistic missiles? Absolutely. But Israel, and one of the things that was not reported, hit their facilities of making solid state fuels that they are not so easy to resupply these ballistic missiles, which gets back to a window of opportunity to strike. So is Iran a paper tiger? Militarily, conventionally, or really could it hurt American ships that are sitting in the aircraft carriers, American soldiers that are sitting in Iraq and Syria, American allies hitting Israel? I think they would try it, but I think the most dangerous threat that would make the most media headlines is activating cells of their proxies. We just read about a cell in Barcelona that was a Hezbollah cell. Now, you remember Hezbollah, unlike Hamas or the Houthis, follows guardianship of the jurist. And they are going to follow the orders of the supreme leader. And there are cells, and through the porous American border, Hezbollah has come into America, and they're in Europe. And so, in fact, they were fundraising legally in Germany, I think, they still be, or not until not long ago. So the terrorism targeting Jewish, Israeli targets, / Western targets are going to happen. But from my point of view, I think if a kinetic action is chosen against their nuclear facilities, I think it will be more stability for the region than not. But the bottom line here is that unless America starts saying we are pro-Iranian, pro-Iranian people, and that it becomes American policy that we want, without boots on the ground, regime change, that the Iranian people who would be our friends, 90 million new friends, the regime doesn't represent the Iranian people, whether we're talking of the Persians or the 45% ethnic minorities. That would add stability to the region. So we want to be with them, again, without boots on the ground. But I think if I told this administration one thing to do, is rhetorically say we are with the Iranian people, and there are plenty of things we could do to support the Iranian people. And we should, I'm ashamed as an American who talks about American national security interests, that we were not in 2021 of standing strong with the protests. I'm ashamed of the Green Revolution and many things in between. By the way, Americans have no clue, because the media doesn't report, on protests that happen all the time in Iran. And we should be supportive. What are we afraid to say? It is in their ideology. It's baked in, and I hope it's not the Wiskoff approach where they're not married to ideology and referring to Hamas. I hope they don't think the Iranians also are not married to the Iranian regime is not that way. And, they are married to it. And if nothing else economically, the IRGC wants that regime to stay in place. How much money they, make off of that and really control a significant portion of the economy. So we should be able to say clearly that we want a new regime there. They will never stop saying death to America, death to Israel, death to the West, basically. And unfortunately, our allies like the Germans and French and the English are weaklings. And, they keep making excuses for the Iranians. And we know clearly that the Iranians have broken every possible rule regarding enrichment. We know they have the ballistic missiles to hit many places, probably Eastern Europe at this point of time. The only thing we don't think they have yet, and we're not sure, is weaponization. And if there was a kinetic strike against nuclear facilities that are there, probably they should be in conjunction with targeting economic facilities like Bandar Abbas, the container port, Karg Island. And that would create destabilization in the regime so that people, and because we're a beacon, we should be a beacon of democracy for the world, even without boots on the ground. There's plenty of other things we can do to support the Iranian people. And we should basically be very clear about this. And, if we make a deal, if the president makes a deal for Iran nuclear negotiations and something happens there, we have to realize that we have abandoned the Iranian people if we do that.
Now, from a national security perspective, it would seem that it would be in America's interests and that the Iranian people are an asset for them here. Why is it that we haven't seen that kind of support for, maximum support for the Iranian people when it would serve the long-term interests of the American people?
Well, this is a country that's had two Middle East wars and the echoes of that, whether on the Democratic or the Republican side. These long failed wars, in Iraq, Afghanistan, been supposedly trying to pivot out of the Middle East to go to China, but the Middle East keeps sucking us in. And anybody hears the word regime change, they think immediately that this is, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fighting, Americans being put in harm's way for somebody else's interests. And so it is not appealing. It's certainly not appealing to the Republican side, to the Vance Tucker Carlson side on one side, and for Democrats who have been supportive on Ukraine, I don't think they're going to be very supportive on another war. They were the leaders in fighting against those other wars, going back, to 2001, 2, 3, when they started after 9/11. So I think it is the words of regime change. Now, if we had a president, and maybe to be a little scripted, to explain to the American people what he means by that. Or maybe I think Secretary of State Rubio would be fantastic at doing it because he really gets the issues deep down, is to explain that being for the Iranian people does not mean that we're going to have soldiers dying there. I mean, as it is, we have 2,500 soldiers in Iraq and we have maybe 1,000 soldiers in Syria, and the Trump administration wants to remove those despite the disproportionate leverage we have. Small American presence is very good, but I think it's very important to explain to the American people, and really, I think even if President Trump explained to the American people that we want to be for the Iranians for both value-based and national security interests, half the country will be against him just because it came out of his mouth. But I think the attempt needs to be made, and I think the smart way to do is through the Secretary of State and the president backing him.
You talked earlier about these terror cells of Iran throughout the world. Can you give us an idea of the scope? You mentioned the report about the Hezbollah plot or the Hezbollah cell in Spain that was recently discovered. Just how big of a thing is this really, to give us an idea?
I don't think anybody really knows. That's why they call sleeper cells that are there. I think, it's funny. I've become skeptical on intelligence in general. Nobody saw the Arab winter coming. Nobody saw 9/11 coming. Israel didn't, with their great vaulted intelligence, didn't see October 7th coming. This type of stuff, I don't think when, for example, in the States, the FBI, which would know about this stuff, really would want to share any of that information. My impression is they are significant. And all it takes is one or two attacks. God forbid there's an attack in the New York City subway system, something very symbolic. There's something that happens in Chicago, a major city. The Americans don't let go of it. It's not like the Israelis who have it and the next day they're back to, they have to move on. Americans don't have that resilience of what's there. And the Iranians are smart. The regime could be evil, but it could be very, very smart. And they know it can demoralize America. On the other hand, they could also see how America can come together if they can have plausible deniability. I mean, that's, I think, one of the questions. President Trump just began to talk about it when he said about the Houthis that it's Iran, we know who gives them the missiles. So if we start saying if there are any terrorist attacks from Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, any place that we hold Tehran responsible, the address to make a difference. And that's really, if the president wanted to stop the Houthi attacks, his best address would be to attack something on Iranian soil. So we need to let people know not to give any plausible deniability when these cells are activated. And I think it's just a matter of time. And again, I think they will try to confine themselves to Israeli or Jewish targets because people, the West can just say, well, it wasn't us, and which unfortunately you and I know that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine, and so it will, if once it starts there, it does not end. So getting back, I don't think we really know the size. I do think it's significant.
And a dash for the bomb, their other kind of deterrence factor here for Iran. Ali Larijani, the senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, recently said that if the United States bombs Iran, then they would be, quote, forced to pursue nuclear weapons. Just how capable, given Iran's weakened state right now, is Iran from weaponization? Do we really know?
First of all, we've underestimated Iran. Even when the Israelis stole the nuclear archives, showing that they had the ability to weaponize weapons, I think it was 2017-ish.
Yes. Yeah.
When they took it out. It didn't make big headlines saying they have this knowledge. They've shown their interest in doing this. But yet, as recently as this week, our director of national intelligence has said what previous directors of national intelligence has said, that we do not believe Iran is building a bomb at this time. Well, first of all, I think our intelligence is, even though we've had better human intelligence in Iran, and I think the Israelis do too, I'm not sure we will really know when they make that dash to the bomb. What we do know is the enrichment. They can have enough enriched uranium at 90% for many bombs and can produce many for many months. Number two, as I mentioned, they have the means to deliver them, ballistic missiles. Now, imagine in that ballistic missile attack, so say Iran sends 200 more missiles to Israel, and they put on 7 of them nuclear weapons, and because knowing that some will not get through, they believe Israel's a one-bomb state. They could also get weapons, fully made weapons from North Korea on a container ship. That's something else we should keep in mind. The weaponization part is supposedly the only thing they have. Supposedly it's spread out through the country. Again, that will depend upon human intelligence. Does America have the knowledge or the will to stop the weaponization? The Iranians say we have a right to have nuclear weapons, although there's supposedly a fatwa against it. But now, even rhetorically, they're saying you are forcing us to have this. Well, the Iranians, if they were able to keep, if they were not an aggressor state, part of the axis of aggression, wouldn't have to worry about this. There's a reason why America and Israel and Europe should be worried about an Iranian weapon here. So how far are they away? You keep getting the same things, at least in open source intelligence, 6, 12, 18 months away. I fear it's closer to the shorter period of time. And, I think they're going to claim that they have a nuclear weapon. The question is, how would you know they have it? That would mean detonating a nuclear weapon, sort of what India and Pakistan did all those years ago to prove they had that. A lot of their stuff that they have from the North Koreans, and it is not really maybe up to the standard. So a detonation test that may not be successful initially, but sooner or later they're going to be there. They have all the knowledge. They have the desire. The only way to get rid of the desire is regime change.
And, it was interesting. Actually, I don't know if you've read this book. It's called Target Tehran. And it was about the Israeli secret Mossad operation.
I reviewed the book. So I actually wrote the review.
Oh, you did? It's fantastic. And you're right. Like, there was really a lack of international reaction. And it was fascinating, the great links and risks that Mossad went through to get those nuclear archives.
Yeah, it was, and it just seems to be that if it was a different country than Israel providing this information, that it would be somehow seemingly more credible. But a lot of the world, whether it's animosity to Israel for whatever reason, or for the Europeans, it's not us. When there were hijacking going on from Palestinian groups in Europe in the 1970s, the Europeans looked the other way, released the terrorists. They said, we made a deal with them. They're not going to attack us. They're only going to attack the Jews. There's this kind of thing amongst Europe of what it is. And I think it is incredibly short-sighted, whether they like Israel or not. If you look at the words, when you read sermons of what is said, and again, it's both radical Shiism and Sunnism. They don't want to end, with Israel. They really see the West as the, from Iran, they make it very clear. It's the great Satan. Israel's just the little Satan.
Yeah, it's definitely part of a much greater issue that affects everybody. And you had a front row to the JCPOA negotiations. Tell us about that and what you learned and how that applies to what's happening today.
So I was working at that time with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee doing briefings there with the chairman's office. It was a terrible deal. Nowadays, if you say it's a bad deal, you're a hawk. And if you say it was a good deal and it's best you could have gone, you get it. But it was a terrible deal. We, America, unfortunately, President Obama, I think out of naivete, gave the world's leading state sponsor of terror the right to enrich uranium. We didn't give that to anybody else in the world other than the big boys. France and England and China, no, any other country, including democracies. What they did was if they enriched in a civilian program, the spent rods had to come out, be sent to one of those, major nations that had it. And so they could not build up nuclear material. They could never enrich past 3.5%, nothing more than you need for uranium. The nonsense about medical isotopes that you need higher percentages could have easily been taken care of. So what was done at that time, number one, the bad things that were done. And again, I'll give the Obama administration credit. They brilliantly outplayed the people against the deal. They needed to get to 60 senators to have a vote of disapproval of the deal. And unfortunately, at that time, Senator Schumer, who was the majority whip, refused to, even though he voted against the deal, he made sure that Obama got a win because he refused as a whip to push any other Democratic senators to vote against it. So they only got 58. So only 42 senators were in favor of it, yet Obama got this approved. So what were the things that were terrible failures? And I think we should basically scrap the whole thing. And that's why, by the way, if you had snapbacks now for 2231, you would go back to point zero in starting negotiations again. We should not be building on the JCPOA. We should not have sunset provisions that are there. We should not allow them to enrich their own uranium. Whether we're talking about, enrichment or going through the plutonium route, I think it's been very clear that they've proven they can't be trusted. That's there, and I think what I saw at that time was the American kicking the can down the road. Obama wouldn't have to deal with it. It would be years before someone would have to deal with it. And that is, again, a tremendous American failure where we don't have the foresight, because every 4 years, maybe 8 years, you have a new president and everything changes. And in between, Senate can be of the other party and slow things down. And the other thing that we made a major mistake about is that we never brought the most consequential deal America as internationally made, a treaty, and we never allowed it to be voted as a treaty. So people don't realize that JCPOA, why President Trump was able to leave it, whether for good or for ill, was it was no more than an executive action by President Obama. It actually was, they could have never gotten enough senators to vote for it as a treaty, as it should have been voted for. So I think the idea of doing snapback, going back to ground zero now, and if the Iranians don't want to play ball, I think there's enough history since 1979 to know who they are, what they want, and to think that they're not going to have a nuclear weapon at some point is foolish. And again, will they have a mad dash to it, to counter the American buildup of military threat? Nobody really knows. But you can't take that chance because the risks so outweigh the benefits of a bad nuclear deal.
Let's turn our focus to Russia now. In response to Donald Trump's threats to bomb Iran's nuclear sites, Russia has warned of, quote, catastrophic consequences if Iran is attacked. What do they even mean by that? Like, what could Russia do here?
Well, Russia is part of the axis of aggression, axis that incorporates Iran, Russia, North Korea, China. Basically, what they're joined by is to weaken the United States in any possible way. Russia is pretty preoccupied with Ukraine at this point of time. The threats, I would not worry about the threats of Russia. Listen, they have probably the world's largest nuclear missile arsenal, but I don't think that's realistic. They were somebody who, at least in the Soviet Union, could be dissuaded by mutually assured destruction, something the Iranians are not. I cannot be in the negotiations thought of to have MAD be a part of your policy. So I think that is bravado, standing with an ally. What do the Iranians do for the Russians? Well, look, they're making them the drones that have been so effective against Ukraine. They're sending them missiles. So again, in the great goal to weakening America, putting your thumb in America's eye, getting America out of the Middle East, there's so many different things. Russia wants them out, but I don't think Russia, especially since their major patron, Syria, is gone in the Middle East. They're trying to hang on to Tartus and Kniam, their naval port on the Mediterranean, and their air base there. So I don't think, and they're preoccupied with Ukraine. So I think it's more bluster than anything else. I would not worry about that. The Chinese have economic interests. Nothing kinetic with them. So I think Iran we should look at as alone. There's a great window of opportunity right now with their air defenses down. that your credible military threat is much stronger. And remember, those missile defenses will not be down for much longer, because if there's a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, those S-300 systems that are there now in Russia can be moved to Iran. And they've also promised there's supposed to a deal.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, not only for S-400s, an even more evolved system, but for the Su-35 jets that the Russians have promised. And again, the Russians owe the Iranians because they've been very helpful to them during their Ukraine war. So Iran is not giving up. Iran's proxies, they may be down, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, but they're not stopping. If you want to stop the proxies, you stop Tehran. You want to have a more stable Middle East, the address is the nuclear facilities, and most importantly, don't forget the Iranian people.
And beyond Russia's bluster, as you said, would Russia at the very least try and dissuade or influence President Trump in any way, do you think?
Absolutely. So, President Trump's choice of friends, Putin, Erdogan, I kind of cringe a little bit at that, and I would hope that he sees them for who they are. But would Putin try to influence President Trump? Absolutely. Is President Trump vulnerable to pressure from Putin? Absolutely. So I would certainly worry about that because it seems that the president again wants victories. And if there's any way you can have a victory, with a negotiation, or have that he can say that he has settled a war between Israel, Hamas, Russia, and Ukraine. We didn't need to bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran. Those are victories for the president, and he thinks his pathway is with Putin as a major part of it. I think Putin should be marginalized. The president thinks very differently, and I think that undermines our interests.
And then there's Israel. Israeli Channel 14 reported that a major strike, quote, unprecedented since World War II, may be imminent in Iran. So clearly the Israelis have made it obvious they do want military strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Who has more influence here over Trump, in your view? Is it Netanyahu or is it Putin?
It depends upon, I think, the issue. Who will have more influence. The Israelis, right and left, still think Iran is the number one threat and will come together. Gets to another question, half a degree of separation from the original question, are Israelis alone capable of dealing a significant blow to Iran? So America has those massive ordnance penetrators that can be delivered by B-2s, maybe B-52s, things Israel doesn't have. And Israel doesn't have the pilots trained on there. So with what Israel has, and by the way, there's other things, cyber attacks and all kinds of other things, but we're talking about what we can think of very simplistically. Israel has bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, and they would have to hit facilities where there's weakening, through the buried tunnels 1, 2, 3 times in a row, precise strikes to have something equivalent, maybe close to a massive ordnance. So can Israel do that? I don't know, when I ask, and I've asked over the years, they say they can do it. But maybe Israel only has to hit that, as I said before, Karg Island and Bandar Abbas, and destabilize the regime and the Iranian people if backed up by America helping the Iranian people, maybe with funds. If there are labor strikes like they did with Poland, America did, before the fall of the Cold War with Lech Walesa. If America helped with cyber attacks against the Iranian morality police, if America had Starlink and it was able to give capabilities when Iran knocks down or closes its internet when there's uprisings occurring.
Every time. That's the first thing they do.
It's the first thing they do. So I think America has to work with Israel. Israel has to work with America, even if America is not striking Iran. But I do trust Israeli intelligence here more than American intelligence to seeing if they're going to make a mad dash for a bomb. But if they make a mad dash now, is Trump really, just saber rattling, with all these, with the B-2s and the 140, support aircraft and all this stuff, with the new aircraft group coming over, from now it's in the Philippines, that we're going to have two aircraft groups, so you're going to have many more abilities to have sorties into Iran if that's where they were going. I don't know. I think it's so superficial and so clear that it has the feeling of not real at this time. But again, with President Trump, it's supposedly the last person in the room who has his ear last is the one who's going to help him make the decision, who's going to be there. But again, I don't think Trump wants another war. And I think the fact that I think Iran is betting that Trump doesn't want another war and has backed down from the maximalist rhetoric is I think Iran is banking on. And they may be right, but I think, and that a credible military threat only works if they think you're going to use it.
I guess things are up in the air. Nobody really knows.
They don't, especially with this president who's impetuous, about things that come out there. We really don't know, but we do. We can look back and people can, to fulfill their whatever they believe. They say, look, he hit Soleimani. That was a big deal, on Iraqi soil. If American soldiers are hit, that's where he acts. But here,
and sorry to interrupt, it's my understanding, based on the novel Target Tehran, is that he didn't actually want to hit Soleimani initially, that he had some concerns about the repercussions, and it was the head of the CIA at that time. I'm forgetting her name right now, and she basically told him, listen, I don't know how the Iranians are going to react, but it's going to be far worse if we don't do anything. And that was, as you said, the last thing he heard, and then they made the decision that, okay, let's do this. I didn't know about the hesitation he had.
Well, there were plenty of people who did not want it, that thought that was provocative. But remember, Soleimani and his associates had American blood on their hands. There was a direct connection between Iran and the wars we had with IEDs and killing American soldiers, maiming American soldiers. So you make that connection. So I think President Trump needs to be convinced that Americans are going to die in order to act upon Iran. Not just doing it for Israel's interests. Because if you're going to do this, if Israel's going to act and it's not going to be capable to do what it really needs to do, then this is going to bite America much worse. So America might as well get into the game to make sure what is needed is truly done. And there's no doubt our forces are capable of things the Israelis are not.
And earlier in the podcast, you talked about Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia is allegedly refusing to allow Washington to use their air bases should there be an attack on Iran. And you mentioned that they fear that the Americans won't be there for them in the long run. Trump has announced that Saudi Arabia is going to be his first international visit. Given that context and what we talked about earlier and the tensions rising with Iran and the potential for a war, how significant is Saudi Arabia as a choice of destination?
I think it's important, but it's probably more important for economic interests. The president is touting $1 trillion. Last time he got $450 billion in his first time he went to Saudi Arabia. The last time, now he's going to invest. The Saudis going to invest $1 billion in America. What the Saudis ultimately want is they're not going to become part of NATO. And as far as is some type of defense umbrella that a 2019 can't happen again. And they want to be elevated to the point that they feel America is going to defend them, and it's going to transcend from a Trump administration to whatever comes next, and will be long. I don't see American Senate voting on a treaty with Saudi Arabia, so it's going to be hard to convince them. The other thing they want is a civilian nuclear program that they can enrich. I think that's also a mistake. They also want to be, because there was a weapons embargo during the last administration, they would like to have they want to have the most advanced American weapons. So, and listen, the president can be convinced of that because, hey, if they're going to buy the most advanced American weapons, that's going to be billions upon billions of more dollars that are going to be invested in America. And that may be part of that $1 trillion that he's calculating that's there. The Saudis are trying to play Switzerland, where now, they're elevating themselves, where they can be, the Ukrainians can come here, the Russians come here, the Americans can come here. So a lot of Middle East countries that like to play, think they're Switzerland. Oman was trying to do that, but unfortunately the Houthis are hanging out there a little too frequently. The Qataris are doing that, except that they have been sponsoring the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni radical jihadism, and they're also very close to Iran. In their defense, they share the world's largest gas field there, but both Democrats and Republicans don't seem to see Qatar for what they are. We know we're not on this, but then you get to Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Those are two countries that don't like one another, and we abandoned the Saudis and UAE when they tried to isolate the Qataris, which again was, I think, a major mistake, because we need to have the Qataris playing more on the western side of the basketball court as opposed to playing it on both sides. So Saudi Arabia, they're going to have to be convinced. The president can be swayed by monies and economic interests. But as far as Iran goes, deep down, I know this, having been in Saudi Arabia, talking to intelligence, defense, security people, they fear Iran. They don't articulate it very loudly, but they fear Iran. Sort of like, it's almost like when they say we want a Palestinian state, I know they don't really care. When they say, we want to be friends with Iran, they know they can't be friends with the 12 Shiites of Iran. Deep down, that is a mortal enemy. But this is the Middle East. And we Americans are playing checkers and don't understand that both our allies and adversaries there are thinking long-term and are playing five-dimensional chess.
And just to conclude, is the U.S. and Iran conflict nearing a dangerous tipping point like we've never seen before? And I asked that because the other day, I think I was just Googling U.S. and Iran relations, and I watched this video package on CNN. And it was about how Iran and the U.S. were on the brink of war. It's never been more of a dangerous time than now, blah, 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 blah. And then I looked at the publishing date and I realized, oh my God, the story is from 2020. But it made me feel like it was happening right now. So have things changed? Are we really on the brink of something this time versus what we were hearing in 2020? Or is it just more of the same again?
Also, Groundhog Day does come back all the time. I mean, you could think about the Israelis. You had at one point of time, Netanyahu and Ehud Barak wanted to attack Iran, and the rest of the security cabinet, and that's more than 10 years ago. I think it was 2011 or whatever it was, that Barak was I believe, the defense minister at that time. So America, it's always the worst thing. It's about to happen. If you look back, we've heard this, but I think this is a different time. In the post-October 7th world, the fact that Iran attacked Israel, the fact that Iran's proxies were degraded by Israel, the fact that Israel degraded the Iranian system, the missile defense system, the fact that you have a new president who is unpredictable, who has shown that he may be willing to act. We don't know. Certainly not the Biden administration's Middle East policy that was all about de-escalation, which basically was an invitation to be provocative for all of our adversaries. So I do think this is a different time. It should be a different time because America has an opportunity at this time. I think this is an opportunity that if we waste it, we're going to look back and say, boy, did we make a mistake. So I do think this is a different time. I think 2025 is an important year. And by the way, silence or not acting is a choice. And if that is the choice that happens, America decides to do, if President wants to go for full negotiations, but I think he has to understand what would really make a difference. For example, again, in the weeds, just for a second before we conclude, the IAEA, which is looking at the Iranian nuclear file and has been blocked from lots of places. We agreed in the JCPOA not to allow them to go into military bases where they are weaponizing and doing things. We need American inspectors. I mean, I think we're in a point of leverage against the Iranians, and no matter what they say, and we need to say, this is what we need, X, Y, and Z. And if we don't get this, then the military action is going to come. I think the threat and an expiration date can make 2025 a year that could be active, but a year that leads to a much more stable Middle East. They are still, the Iranians, they're still the most destabilizing part of the Middle East. And the Iranian people are the people most deserving in the Middle East of taking control of their lives and freedom. And that's the side we should be on for security interests and moral value-based interests.
Well, thank you so much. That's Dr. Eric Mandel joining us from New York. I really appreciate your insight and expertise, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
I did. Thank you so much.
If you like this episode, hit the like button, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.